About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion. I didn't stay the night there because I had to get back for work the following day, and when I was almost halfway through the 2-hour drive home, it was starting to get pretty late. Most of the drive was on roads with dense bushes and trees on either side, the real creepy ones you see in the movies. I had been driving for 45 minutes now and was starting to get very tired. You know how sometimes you suddenly become completely exhausted out of nowhere? Well, that's exactly what I was experiencing. I knew I wasn't gonna last. I could feel it in my eyelids and in my breath, but I wasn't seeing any place that felt safe enough to pull off, park, and sleep. After a few minutes, it became clear to me that I wasn't gonna find an ideal spot, but my exhaustion wasn't going away. It was then that my fatigue caused me to do something questionable. I pulled over to the side of the road onto the grass and situated my car behind some bushes, trying to hide the vehicle from the prying eyes of anyone else who might come past. I did notice the cars were passing every few minutes, so the roads were not completely empty at this hour. I made a mental note that the time was 11:22 p.m. and then fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awoken by a scratching sound. I looked at the clock. It was 11:50 p.m. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and because I was still extremely tired, I attributed this sound to bushes lightly scratching against my car in the late night breeze. Satisfied with my assessment, I simply went back to sleep. Again, I was awoken by the same sound, and it was now 12:40 a.m. This time, however, the sound didn't stop. The thought crossed my mind that it could be an animal inspecting the car, but then I thought, why would it return almost an hour after it had left the previous time, assuming it was the animal and not the bushes that had woken me up earlier? I looked in my rearview mirror and just managed to catch a glimpse of something running away into the woods. Now at the time, my mind immediately went to the hook killer. You know, the psycho from the urban legends that scratched the couple's car and then slaughtered the guy when he got out to investigate. It was time to get out of there. I could see a bend in the road no more than 100 yards ahead, so I started the car and punched the gas, fishtailing as I spun through the dirt and onto the road. I neared the bend, and as I came around it, I suddenly saw a car parked off to the side of the road, the driver's door hanging open. I slowed down to try to get a look to see if there was anyone in there, but as I crept past, I could see the seat was empty. Again, I checked my rearview mirror, but I saw nothing. Suddenly, a man came sprinting around the back of the parked car. He screamed at me, shouting for me to get out of the car immediately. Without thinking, I kicked my foot out and slammed the gas pedal against the floor of my car and sped off. I never saw the guy again. Word of advice: find a hotel. Don't sleep on the side of a deserted road. Back in 2004, I was a young and dumb 17-year-old country girl living in the city for the first time while I attended college. One night, I made this stupid decision to walk from a bar downtown back to my dorm. While walking might not sound like a stupid decision, the fact that it was 1:30 in the morning and that I had no idea where I was definitely changed the situation. Before long, I found myself wandering around a terrible part of the city. Most of the streetlights were busted out, trash lay strewn across the sidewalks and street, and loud, heated arguments echoed from the dilapidated row houses on both sides of the street. In short, I wouldn't want to be in this neighborhood in the middle of the day, let alone in the early hours of the morning. I continued walking, and a few minutes later a car drives up behind me and slows down so that they were keeping pace with me for nearly the entire block. I look over my shoulder, and I see at least 5 unsavory men huddled inside. I turned to face the street ahead, suddenly realizing just how bad my situation had gotten. I continued walking, and as I approached an intersection, the car pulled around me and swung a sharp left and stopped in the street directly in my path. I completely panic at this point and stand there frozen right in front of them. My mind went blank. I'd never been this scared in my life. Flight mechanisms took over and I began searching for a way out, but in my heart I knew it didn't make sense to run. They were close, and surely would have caught me before I could escape. I'm not sure how long I stood there motionless, but suddenly a light flashed to life and the porch behind the car lit up like a beacon. A man casually strolls from his porch, down the steps carrying a bag of trash. The guys in the car panic. They jump back in and peel away. I broke down, crying and shaking. The guy checks to see if I'm okay and invites me inside for a soda. He and his roommate walked me back to my dorm. They both turned out to be great guys. I never saw them again. I don't even remember their names, but I feel absolutely confident that if that guy hadn't decided to take his trash out at 1 a.m. on a Saturday, my life would have taken a much different path that night. When I was 13 or 14 years old, I lived on a farm in North Carolina. This wasn't a normal farm you would expect with fields full of beans and other crops. It was actually a pine tree harvestry. The house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pines, and the living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a complete custom home built by a dentist in the 1930s. The window in the living room stretched nearly the entire length of the room. And since the house was built on a subtle hill, the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground. Because of this, the angle was situated in such a way that you could see out over a solid mile of pine trees. Frankly, during the winter, it was pretty unsettling because after even a light snowfall, there was enough moonlight reflected you could see dogs running around between the trees at night. I hated that room and that window. One weekend, a cousin of mine had come to visit, and we found ourselves doing all the things most kids do in the country, which included throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what happens. After a while, we grew bored with that and decided to build a kingdom of couch cushions and a blanket fort in the living room and get ready for bed. The fire soon died down, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary until we heard the dogs barking. The barking was faint and obviously far away, so we assumed they were chasing animals through the trees looking for a late meal. I noticed my cousin sitting up, looking out the window, not just looking, but staring with intent. I asked him what was going on, and without taking his eyes off the window, he tells me that he feels like he's seeing things. Naturally, I'm immediately anxious, and joined him at the window to try to see what he was seeing. Nothing happened for a few minutes, and he got more and more annoyed with me because I kept asking what he had seen. He shushes me a few times, telling me to be quiet so he can focus. And then we both see it. A shadow of a person moves from one tree to the next. They weren't running or leaping, but more of a brisk walk from one tree to another. They were 100 yards from the house, so we couldn't actually tell if the person was coming closer or not, because the moonlight reflecting off the snow made it tough to tell depth and direction. Oddly enough, we weren't freaked out at this point, mostly because we weren't quite sure what we had seen, and had almost begun to think we hadn't actually seen anything at all. Sure, we should have gone to wake up my dad, but he wasn't exactly the cautious type, and was more likely to burst onto the front porch with his rifle and holler into the woods. We were, however, just scared enough that we did not want to taunt whatever was out there. We continued to stare, and about 3 minutes later it happened again, but this time, the movement was 50 feet or so from where we'd seen the first silhouette. Another person, another tree. They moved a few strides and then they were gone. This continued to happen every few minutes for the next half hour. My cousin and I just stared into the trees, trying to figure out what we were seeing. At this point, I should mention that there really were no neighbors. The land surrounding the farm was federal paper, so it was miles and miles of uncultivated trees. The only people you'd see at the farm were people who intended to be there. We kept watching as these two figures intermittently appeared and vanished in tandem, until finally we see one appear, but not disappear. We focus on it, and suddenly notice that the figure is running towards us. Both my cousin and I trip over each other trying to get to my dad's room to wake him up, but by the time we get back to the living room with my half-awake father, there's no one in sight. Nothing. We sprint around the house, locking doors and windows. Being a big farmhouse, there was many doors. The worst feeling was every time I approached a door to unlock it, I was sure one of the figures was going to burst through and grab me. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and we were able to get everything locked. We must have walked around the house 50 times, double-checking doors and windows and making sure nothing had gotten in. We then convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this take care of our own mentality, so dialing 911 simply wasn't an option. We didn't see the figures again that night, and it took several hours of seeing nothing before my cousin and I were able to sleep. In the morning, we went out to the tree line to check things out, and we saw footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between the trees and in paths leading in and out of the tree line. and then we followed one path of footprints straight to the house, below the window, looking up into the living room.